The champagne flute trembled in my grip as my father's voice boomed across the mahogany-paneled dining room of Denver's most exclusive private club. My daughter Zara? Oh, she's still playing around with computers in her little apartment, Vincent Blackwood announced to his circle of distinguished friends, his laughter cutting through me like shattered glass. You know how these young women are with their hobbies. She'll grow out of it eventually and find herself a proper husband. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Continental Club's crystal chandeliers cast warm amber light across the faces of Denver's financial elite, all nodding knowingly at my father's dismissive words. I sat frozen at the far end of the table, watching the man who raised me reduce 6 years of relentless work, sleepless nights, and breakthrough innovations to nothing more than a phase I'd eventually outgrow. My name is Zara Blackwood, I'm 29 years old, and this is the story of how my father's need to impress his wealthy friends backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. 3 hours before this moment, I had been riding the highest wave of my professional life. That morning, Forbes had published their annual 30 under 30 inches tech innovators list, and my AI startup Neuralink Solutions hadn't just made the list, we'd landed the cover story. The article detailed how my artificial intelligence platform was revolutionizing healthcare diagnostics, how we'd secured $47 million in Series B funding, and how major hospitals across 3 countries were implementing our technology to save lives. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Forbes was calling me the visionary who's reshaping modern medicine, my own father was introducing me to his retirement dinner guests as someone who tinkers with computers in her spare time. Vincent Blackwood had spent 38 years climbing the corporate ladder at Pinnacle Financial, Denver's oldest investment firm. Tonight was his farewell celebration, his final hurrah before stepping into a retirement funded by decades of conservative investment strategies and old money connections. He'd reserved the Continental Club's private dining room, the same room where oil barons and railroad tycoons had made deals that built Colorado a century ago. The guest list read like Denver's social register. Richard Thornfield, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Denver, sat to my father's right, adjusting his vintage Rolex as he nodded along with every word. Gregory Ashford, the silver-haired patriarch of Ashford and Associates law firm, lounged in his custom-tailored suit, swirling his 30-year-old scotch with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. William Sterling, whose investment portfolio included stakes in 3 major Colorado ski resorts, leaned forward with the predatory interest of a man always looking for the next networking opportunity. These were the men my father had spent his entire career trying to impress, the inner circle he'd finally earned his way into just as he was leaving the game. Tonight wasn't really about celebrating his retirement, it was about cementing his legacy, proving to these titans of industry that Vincent Blackwood belonged among them. And apparently having a daughter who played with computers didn't fit the image he wanted to project. I thought back to 6 years ago, when I'd first approached my father about my business idea. I'd been working as a software engineer at a medical device company, but I'd identified a gap in the market that was keeping me awake at night. Doctors were missing critical diagnoses because they were overwhelmed with dementia, and I knew I could build an AI system that would help them spot patterns human eyes might miss. I'd spent months developing the initial algorithms, working 16-hour days and surviving on coffee and determination. When I'd finally gathered the courage to pitch my idea to my father, hoping for his support or even just his belief in my vision, he'd barely looked up from his financial reports. "Zara, honey," he'd said with that patronizing smile I'd grown to hate, "you have a perfectly good job. Why would you want to throw that away to start some risky computer business? You're not getting any younger, and Marcus is already talking about giving us grandchildren. Maybe you should focus on finding someone to settle down with instead of chasing these entrepreneurial fantasies." Marcus, my older brother by 3 years, had followed our father's footsteps into traditional finance. He worked as a portfolio manager at a mid-sized firm, earned a respectable 6-figure salary, and had married Caroline, a lawyer from another established Denver family. They lived in a beautiful colonial house in Cherry Hills Village, drove matching BMW sedans, and had recently announced they were expecting their first child. In my father's eyes, Marcus had checked all the boxes of conventional success, while I was still trying to prove that my path had any value at all. That night 6 years ago, when my father dismissed my business idea, I'd made a decision that would define everything that followed. I wouldn't ask for his support again, I wouldn't update him on my progress, share my victories, or seek his approval. If he wanted to see my work as a hobby, I'd let him maintain that illusion while I built something extraordinary behind the scenes. The early days had been brutal. I'd maxed out 3 credit cards, lived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, and turned my small Capitol Hill apartment into a combination office, laboratory and crash pad for the small team of developers I'd managed to recruit. We worked 18-hour days, debugging code until our eyes burned and testing algorithms until we could recite error messages in our sleep. There were nights when I questioned everything, when the isolation of not having my family's support felt overwhelming, when the financial pressure made me consider giving up and crawling back to the safety of my old corporate job. But then we'd have a breakthrough. Our AI would successfully identify a rare condition that had stumped human doctors, or we'd optimize an algorithm that could process diagnostic images 30% faster than our competitors. Each small victory reminded me why I'd started this journey, why I believed technology could save lives in ways that traditional medicine couldn't achieve alone. The funding rounds had been their own kind of warfare. Venture capitalists, almost exclusively middle-aged men in expensive suits, would look at me across polished conference tables with barely concealed skepticism. They'd question whether someone my age could really understand the complexities of healthcare, whether a woman could lead a technical team, whether my vision was realistic or just another Silicon Valley pipe dream. I'd learned to anticipate their doubts and answer them before they were voiced, to present data so compelling that their personal biases became irrelevant. When we closed our Series A round at $8 million, I'd wanted to call my father and share the news. When we landed our first major hospital contract, I drafted a text message to him that I never sent. When Forbes reached out for their first interview, I'd imagined the pride on his face when he saw his daughter's photo on newsstands across the country. But each time, I remembered his words about my computer hobbies and decided that my success would speak for itself when the time was right. Now, sitting in this opulent dining room, surrounded by Denver's business elite, watching my father actively diminish my accomplishments to enhance his own social standing, I realized the time would never be right. Vincent Blackwood wasn't going to spontaneously develop respect for his daughter's achievements. If anything, my success threatened his carefully constructed narrative about what his children should become. Computers are so complicated these days, Patricia Blackwood, my mother added with a nervous laugh, clearly trying to redirect the conversation away from what she saw as an embarrassing topic. She'd spent the last hour making sure everyone knew about Marcus's recent promotion, Caroline's pregnancy, and their plans to buy a larger house in an even more prestigious neighborhood. My mother had always been my father's perfect complement, a woman who understood that social status was currency and that every family story needed to be carefully curated for maximum impact. I keep telling her she should use those technical skills to find a nice job at a stable company, my father continued, clearly warming to his theme. Maybe something in IT support or data entry, at least then she'd have benefits and a retirement plan. This startup nonsense is just a way to avoid growing up and taking responsibility. Richard Thornfield nodded approvingly. Young people today think they can just invent success instead of earning it the hard way. In my day, you started at the bottom and worked your way up through established institutions. You didn't just decide to become an entrepreneur because you had some half-baked idea about computers. I felt my jaw clench as Gregory Ashford joined the conversation. My law firm sees these tech startups fail all the time. Kids with no business experience, no understanding of market realities, thinking they can disrupt entire industries with an app. It usually ends with bankruptcy and a harsh lesson about why traditional career paths exist. The dismissal in their voices wasn't just about me personally, it was about everything I represented. A young woman who'd refused to follow the prescribed path, who'd chosen innovation over stability, who'd believed she could build something meaningful without their approval or guidance. To them, I was a cautionary tale about what happened when people didn't respect the established order. William Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his scotch with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything. The tech bubble is going to burst eventually, just like it did in 2000. These inflated valuations, these companies that have never turned a profit, it's all going to come crashing down. The smart money is still in real estate, traditional investments, tangible assets you can see and touch. My father nodded sagely, clearly pleased that his friends were validating his perspective on my career choices. That's exactly what I've been trying to tell Zara. You can't build a future on algorithms and venture capital. At some point, you need to come back to earth and focus on real wealth, the kind that lasts for generations. I thought about the notification that had appeared on my phone just 2 hours earlier. Our lead investor had sent me a screenshot of a Reuters article reporting that two major pharmaceutical companies were in talks to license our diagnostic AI for their research divisions. The deals, if they materialized, would be worth somewhere north of $60 million and would establish Neuralink Solutions as the industry standard for AI-assisted medical diagnosis. But Vincent Blackwood didn't know about any of that. He didn't know that our technology was already being used in 17 countries, that we'd helped identify over 3,000 cases of rare diseases that might have otherwise gone undiagnosed, that major medical journals were publishing papers about the effectiveness of our algorithms. He didn't know that the Forbes article sitting unread on his coffee table at home featured a 2-page spread about his daughter's company and its potential to transform modern healthcare. Marcus, on the other hand, my father said, turning to beam at my brother, has always understood the value of building a solid foundation. Portfolio management, working with established clients, growing wealth through proven strategies. That's how you create lasting success. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, offering me an apologetic glance that didn't quite mask his embarrassment about the situation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He'd always been caught in the middle of our family's dynamics, trying to maintain his position as the favored child, while occasionally defending me against our parents' more harsh judgments. Tonight, though, surrounded by his father's powerful friends and basking in their approval, he seemed content to let the criticism of his sister go unchallenged. Caroline, my sister-in-law, nodded along with the conversation while scrolling through her phone with one manicured finger. She'd always treated me with polite indifference, the kind of surface-level kindness that wealthy women perfected to avoid appearing openly hostile. She understood that I was the family member who didn't quite fit the mold, the one who made social introductions slightly awkward, and she'd learned to simply ignore my existence whenever possible. The waitstaff moved silently around our table, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates with the practiced invisibility that expensive service required. I wondered what they thought about this conversation, whether they recognized the casual cruelty in the way my family was discussing my life choices, whether they'd seen similar scenes play out in this same dining room over the decades. Richard Thornfield raised his glass in a toast. To Vincent Blackwood, a man who understood that success comes from patience, wisdom, and surrounding yourself with the right people. 38 years of steady growth, conservative investments, and smart partnerships. That's how you build something that lasts. The crystal glasses clinked together around the table, the sound sharp and celebratory. My father's face glowed with pride and satisfaction, his moment of recognition finally arriving after decades of careful networking and strategic relationship building. This was what he'd worked toward his entire career: acceptance into Denver's financial aristocracy, the respect of men whose families had been wealthy for generations, the social capital that money alone couldn't buy. As I sat there listening to their toasts and congratulations, watching my father bask in the approval of his peers, while simultaneously diminishing everything I'd accomplished, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and disappointment I'd carried for 6 years began to transform into something else entirely, a calm, focused determination to finally set the record straight. I pulled out my phone and opened my Forbes app, scrolling to the article that had been published that morning. The headline read, "How Zara Blackwood's AI Revolution is Saving Lives and Disrupting Healthcare," accompanied by a photo of me in my laboratory, surrounded by the monitors and equipment that powered our diagnostic algorithms. The article detailed our $47 million funding round, our partnerships with major medical institutions, and our plans for international expansion. Most importantly, it included a section about our financial projections, our revenue growth, and our valuation, numbers that would make even Richard Thornfield's real estate portfolio look modest by comparison. I looked up from my phone to find Gregory Ashford launching into another story about young entrepreneurs who'd failed to understand market realities, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades watching other people's dreams crumble. William Sterling was nodding along while checking his own phone, probably monitoring his investment accounts, or reading the financial news that would inform tomorrow's business decisions. My father sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, finally comfortable in his role as patriarch of a successful family, surrounded by the men whose respect he'd spent his entire career earning. He had no idea that in the next few minutes, everything about this carefully orchestrated evening was about to change forever. The Forbes article was just the beginning. Tomorrow, the Wall Street Journal would publish their own feature about Neuralink solutions and our role in the next generation of medical technology. Next week, I was scheduled to deliver a keynote address at the International Conference on AI in Healthcare, where I'd be presenting our latest breakthrough in cancer detection algorithms to an audience of the world's leading medical researchers. But tonight, in this room full of men who believed they understood the nature of success and failure, who thought they could predict the future of business based on the patterns of the past, I was still just Vincent Blackwood's daughter who played with computers in her spare time. That was about to change. The conversation around the table had evolved into what my father clearly considered his crowning moment. William Sterling was regaling the group with stories about his latest ski resort acquisition, while my father nodded with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of strategic networking. I watched him lean forward slightly whenever one of his guests spoke, his body language broadcasting the deference he still felt toward these men despite tonight being his celebration. "You know, Vincent," Richard Thornfield said, cutting his prime rib with surgical precision, "I've been thinking about our conversation last month regarding investment opportunities. My real estate development group is always looking for partners who understand the value of tangible assets." He paused to take a sip of his wine, letting the implication hang in the air. "Perhaps we should schedule a lunch next week to discuss some possibilities." My father's eyes lit up with barely contained excitement. This was exactly what tonight was supposed to accomplish, the transition from being an employee who served wealthy clients to becoming someone worthy of partnership with them. "I'd be honored, Richard. Retirement gives me the flexibility to explore opportunities I never had time for during my corporate years." Gregory Ashford chuckled, the sound carrying decades of practice superiority. "The beauty of reaching our stage of life is finally having the freedom to make real money instead of just managing it for other people. Though I have to say, Vincent, you've positioned yourself well. Most financial advisors retire with a modest nest egg, but you've clearly been more strategic about building relationships and understanding where the real opportunities lie." I shifted in my seat, feeling the weight of my phone in my purse, where the Forbes article waited like a loaded weapon. The irony of their conversation wasn't lost on me. Here were three men discussing real money and strategic positioning, while completely unaware that the person they'd been dismissing all evening had built something worth more than their combined portfolios. My mother beamed at the praise being directed toward my father, her social antennae perfectly attuned to the subtle dynamics of wealth and status that governed their world. "Vincent has always been so good at seeing the bigger picture," Patricia said, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd spent decades as a corporate wife. "Even when the children were young, he was already thinking about long-term strategies and building the right connections." The mention of childhood memories triggered a flood of recollections I'd been trying to suppress all evening. I remembered the dinner parties my parents used to host when Marcus and I were teenagers, events where we were expected to appear briefly to be introduced to guests before disappearing upstairs to our homework. Even then, I'd noticed how differently my father spoke about Marcus and me. Marcus was following in my footsteps and showing real promise in mathematics and economics. I was artistic and creative code words that everyone understood meant I wasn't serious about building a future that would enhance the family's reputation. Those early experiences had taught me that love in the Blackwood family came with conditions, that approval was something you earned through achievement but only certain kinds of achievement counted. When I'd expressed interest in computer programming during high school, my father had initially been supportive, seeing it as a practical skill that could lead to stable employment. But when I'd started talking about innovation and entrepreneurship, about using technology to solve real-world problems, his enthusiasm had cooled considerably. "The technology sector is so unpredictable," my father was saying now, apparently prompted by some comment I'd missed while lost in my memories. "These young people think they can just create value out of thin air, but real wealth comes from understanding markets that have proven themselves over time. Real estate, energy, financial services, these are the foundations that serious investors build upon." William Sterling nodded sagely while scrolling through something on his phone. "Exactly right. My portfolio manager was just showing me some data about tech startup failure rates. Something like 90% of them fail within the first 5 years. The few that succeed make headlines, but the vast majority burn through their venture capital and leave their investors with nothing to show for it." I thought about the due diligence reports that our Series B investors had compiled before committing $47 million to Neuralink Solutions. They'd spent months analyzing our technology, our market position, our revenue projections, and our competitive advantages. Teams of analysts, former Fortune 500 executives, and industry experts had concluded that our AI platform represented a fundamental breakthrough in medical diagnostics, with the potential to generate billions in revenue over the next decade.
But William Sterling, who'd made his fortune buying and selling ski resorts, apparently understood the technology market better than the venture capital firms who'd built their reputations on identifying the next generation of transformative companies. Caroline finally looked up from her phone, having apparently found something worth sharing with the group. "Speaking of technology," she said, with the slightly condescending tone she used whenever she was about to demonstrate her intellectual superiority, "I was just reading about some AI company that supposedly raised $50 million for medical diagnosis software. Can you imagine, $50 million for a computer program that tells doctors what they should already know?" My heart stopped. She was clearly referring to a news report about Neuralink Solutions, though she'd gotten the funding amount slightly wrong. I watched my father's face carefully, but he showed no signs of recognition. The irony was almost painful. Here was his daughter-in-law casually discussing my company, while he remained completely oblivious to the connection. "These tech valuations are absolutely absurd," Richard Thornfield agreed, setting down his wine glass with authority. "Medical diagnosis has been working fine for centuries without artificial intelligence.
Now suddenly everyone thinks computers can do a better job than trained physicians. It's solving problems that don't exist. Classic Silicon Valley hubris. Gregory Ashford leaned forward with the predatory interest of someone who'd spotted an opportunity to demonstrate his superior wisdom. "My law firm represents several medical malpractice insurers, and they're terrified about the liability issues with AI diagnosis. What happens when the computer makes a mistake? Who gets sued? The software company? The doctor who trusted the algorithm? The hospital that implemented the system? It's a legal nightmare waiting to happen." I gripped my wine glass tighter, fighting the urge to interrupt their ignorant speculation with actual facts about how our technology worked, how it enhanced rather than replaced physician judgment, how our legal team had spent 2 years developing liability frameworks that protected all stakeholders. Instead, I watched my father nod along with their analysis as if he had any understanding of the medical technology market. "That's exactly the kind of reckless speculation that worries me about Zara's computer interests," my father said, seizing the opportunity to redirect the conversation back to his family narrative. "She reads about these overnight success stories and thinks she can just quit her stable job and become the next tech billionaire. I keep trying to explain that these fairy tales are the exception, not the rule, but young people don't want to hear about risk management and steady growth." The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. Here he was, discussing my life and career choices with men who knew nothing about my actual situation, using my supposed failures as a cautionary tale to enhance his own image as a wise patriarch who understood the difference between fantasy and reality. Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that the conversation had taken an unnecessarily harsh turn. "Dad, I don't think Zara sees herself as the next tech billionaire. She's just exploring her interests, trying to find her place in the world. Not everyone has to follow the exact same path." It was a half-hearted defense at best, but I appreciated that my brother had at least attempted to moderate our father's criticism. Marcus had always been caught between his desire to maintain family harmony and his occasional recognition that our parents' treatment of me was unfair. Tonight, surrounded by our father's influential friends and basking in his role as the successful son, he seemed particularly reluctant to rock the boat. "Of course not," my father replied with a patronizing smile, "but there's a difference between exploring interests and making poor life choices. I've seen too many young people waste their 20s chasing unrealistic dreams instead of building solid foundations for their futures. At some point, you have to put aside childish fantasies and focus on what actually works." Patricia nodded in agreement while signaling the waiter for another bottle of wine. "We just want what's best for both our children. Marcus has been so responsible about building his career, getting married, planning for the future. We're hoping Zara will eventually follow his example and find some stability." The waitstaff moved efficiently around our table, their professional invisibility allowing them to serve and clear without interrupting the flow of conversation. I wondered if they'd witnessed similar family dynamics before, other dinner parties where successful parents discussed their children's perceived failures while those same children sat silently absorbing the criticism. William Sterling's phone buzzed with what must have been an important notification because he immediately began scrolling through something with intense focus. After a moment, he looked up with surprise. "This is interesting," he said, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "I just got an alert about that AI medical company Caroline mentioned earlier. Apparently they're featured on the cover of this month's Forbes magazine." My stomach dropped as I watched Caroline immediately begin searching for the article on her own phone. Within seconds she'd found it, her manicured fingers swiping through the digital pages with growing interest. "Here it is," she announced, holding up her phone so the others could see the screen. Neuralink Solutions, founded by some woman named Zara Blackwood. It says here they've raised $47 million and their AI technology is being used in hospitals around the world. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my father's face as he processed what Caroline had just said, the wheels turning slowly as he tried to reconcile the name with his understanding of reality. Richard Thornfield reached for his own phone, clearly intending to verify the information for himself. "Blackwood," my father repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you say Zara Blackwood?" Caroline nodded, still scrolling through the article. "Yes, and there's a photo here. She looks fairly young, maybe late 20s or early 30s. It says she's revolutionizing medical diagnostics with artificial intelligence and that her company is projected to be worth over $200 million within the next 18 months. Gregory Ashford had abandoned his dinner entirely, pulling out his reading glasses to examine his own phone screen. "This can't be right," he muttered, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone whose worldview was being challenged by inconvenient facts. "The article says she's based in Denver, and that she founded the company 6 years ago after leaving her job at a medical device manufacturer." The color had completely drained from my father's face as the implications began to sink in. He turned to look at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been fear. "Zara," he said slowly, "this isn't you don't have the same name as—" I met his gaze steadily, feeling a strange calm descend over me as the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for finally arrived. "Actually," I said quietly, "I do." Richard Thornfield was reading directly from his phone now, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone trying to process information that didn't align with his preconceptions. Founded by Zara Blackwood, age 29, a Denver native who previously worked as a software engineer before developing proprietary algorithms for medical diagnosis. The company has partnerships with major hospitals in 17 countries and has been credited with identifying over 3,000 rare disease cases that might otherwise have gone undiagnosed. William Sterling looked up from his phone with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Vincent, your daughter, is she the same person?" I confirmed, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Though I prefer CEO to computer hobbyist and Neuralink Solutions to playing around with computers in my apartment." The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and profound. The confident chatter of wealthy men discussing their superior understanding of business and finance had been replaced by stunned silence. My father sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through a series of expressions as he tried to process the gap between his perception of his daughter and the reality that was unfolding in front of him. Caroline was still reading from the Forbes article, her voice growing quieter with each detail. "It says here that Ms. Blackwood's AI platform can identify potential diagnoses in complex cases 60% faster than traditional methods, and that the technology has been particularly effective in detecting rare cancers and genetic disorders. The company expects to double its revenue next year and is considering an initial public offering within the next 24 months. Patricia had gone completely pale, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her wine glass. "Zara," she whispered, "why didn't you ever tell us? All these years, you thought I was wasting my life," I finished for her. "You made it very clear that my work wasn't real, that my ambitions were unrealistic, that I needed to find a more suitable path. So I stopped trying to include you in my journey." Gregory Ashford was shaking his head slowly, still staring at his phone screen as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. $200 million, he repeated. "The article says your company is projected to be worth $200 million. That's a conservative estimate," I replied calmly. "Our internal projections suggest we'll cross $300 million by the end of next year, assuming our pharmaceutical partnerships materialize as expected." The weight of those numbers seemed to settle over the table like a heavy blanket. These were men who measured success in millions, who considered themselves sophisticated investors and business leaders. The idea that Vincent Blackwood's supposedly aimless daughter had built something worth more than most of their individual portfolios was clearly challenging everything they thought they understood about success and failure. Richard Thornfield set down his phone and looked directly at me for the first time all evening. Miss Blackwood, he said, his voice carrying a new note of respect that hadn't been there moments earlier, I have to ask, when your father was describing your work as a hobby, why didn't you correct him? I considered the question carefully before responding. Because I learned a long time ago that respect can't be demanded or explained into existence. Either you believe someone has value, or you don't. Tonight proved that my family only respects success after it's been validated by external authorities like Forbes magazine. The accuracy of my observation seemed to hit my father like a physical blow. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words that could bridge the gap between his behavior and his daughter's achievements. Marcus finally broke the silence that had settled over our end of the table. Zara, he said quietly, I had no idea. All these years when you said you were working on your business, I thought it was we all thought, you thought it was cute, I said, not unkindly. You thought it was something I'd eventually grow out of, like Dad's always said. A phase I was going through before settling down and finding a more appropriate path. The truth of those words hung in the air between us, impossible to deny or defend. For 6 years my family had systematically dismissed my work, my ambitions and my achievements. Not out of malice, necessarily, but out of a fundamental inability to imagine that their perception of my capabilities might be wrong. William Sterling was scrolling through what appeared to be additional articles about Neuralink Solutions, his investment instincts clearly activated by the mention of our financial projections. Miss Blackwood, he said, his tone shifting into the careful formality that wealthy men used when they sensed opportunity. I don't suppose your company is currently seeking additional investment partners. The question sparked something that might have been laughter if the situation weren't so surreal. Actually, I replied, we just closed our Series B funding round. But thank you for the interest. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. William Sterling, who had spent the evening dismissing technology investments as reckless speculation, was now trying to position himself as a potential partner in the very company he'd been criticizing minutes earlier. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had opened in the middle of the Continental Club's elegant dining room. My father's hands rested motionless on the white linen tablecloth, his retirement celebration forgotten as he stared at me with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just been shattered. The confident patriarch who had been holding court moments earlier had vanished, replaced by a man struggling to reconcile 6 years of assumptions with the devastating truth now illuminated by the glow of multiple phone screens. Richard Thornfield cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed atmosphere that had descended over our table. Vincent, he said carefully, I think we may need to reconsider some of our earlier observations about technology investments. The understatement was so profound it bordered on comedy, but nobody was laughing. I watched my father's face as Gregory Ashford continued scrolling through articles about Neuralink Solutions, each swipe of his finger revealing new details about my company's partnerships, innovations, and market position. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful to witness. Here was a man who had built his entire career on understanding financial markets and investment opportunities, discovering that he had completely missed the most significant success story sitting at his own dinner table. Zara, my mother whispered, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear her across the table. The Forbes article mentions that you've been working on this for 6 years. That means when you first told us about your business idea. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence as she realized the implications of her own words. When I first told you about my business idea, and Dad called it an unrealistic fantasy, I completed for her. Yes, that's when I started Neuralink Solutions. In my apartment, with 3 credit cards maxed out and a team of developers who believed in the vision even when my own family didn't. The weight of that revelation seemed to settle over my parents like a heavy shroud. Patricia reached for her wine glass with trembling fingers, while Vincent continued to stare at me as if seeing his daughter for the first time. The man who had spent the evening confidently explaining to his wealthy friends why traditional investments were superior to technology speculation was now confronting the reality that his own daughter had built a tech empire worth more than anything he'd achieved in 4 decades of conservative financial planning. William Sterling had abandoned all pretense of dining, his attention fully focused on his phone as he researched Neuralink Solutions with the intensity of someone trying to calculate exactly how much money he might have missed out on. The Wall Street Journal has a piece from last month, he said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. They're calling Neuralink Solutions one of the most promising medical technology companies in North America. The article mentions partnerships with Mayo Clinic,
Johns Hopkins, and several major European hospitals. Caroline looked up from her own phone, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by something that resembled awe. "There's a video interview with the CEO on Bloomberg from 2 weeks ago," she said, then paused as she realized what she was saying. "With you, I mean, you were on Bloomberg television discussing the future of AI in healthcare." The surreal nature of the situation was beginning to overwhelm even my carefully maintained composure. For years I had imagined what it might feel like to finally reveal my success to my family, but I had never anticipated the sheer cognitive whiplash of watching them discover my achievements through external media rather than through my own words. They were learning about my life from news articles and financial reports, as if I were a stranger whose biography they were reading for the first time. Marcus set down his fork and turned to face me directly, his expression a mixture of guilt and amazement. "Zara, I don't understand. All those times when Mom and Dad were pressuring you to find a more stable career, when they suggested you consider working for an established company, why didn't you show them what you were building? Why didn't you prove them wrong?" The question hung in the air between us, and I could feel the entire table waiting for my response. It was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, the opportunity to finally articulate years of accumulated hurt and frustration. "Because," I said slowly, my voice gaining strength as I spoke, "I learned early on that respect in this family is conditional. When I first approached Dad about my business idea 6 years ago, he didn't just dismiss it, he dismissed me. He told me I was being unrealistic, that I needed to focus on finding a husband instead of chasing entrepreneurial fantasies. He made it clear that my vision of using technology to save lives was less valuable than Marcus's safe career in portfolio management." My father flinched as if I had physically struck him, but I continued.
"So I made a decision. I decided that if my family couldn't support me when I had nothing but an idea and determination, then they didn't deserve to share in my success when I had everything. I would build something extraordinary, and when the world finally recognized its value, maybe then my family would understand what they had missed." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Richard Thornfield shifted in his seat, clearly recognizing that he had stumbled into a family drama far more complex than a simple misunderstanding about career choices. Gregory Ashford studied his wine glass with the intensity of someone desperately wishing he were anywhere else. Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Zara, we were just trying to protect you. The business world is so difficult, especially for young women. We wanted you to have security, stability, a future you could count on." "Security," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "You wanted me to have security. Do you know what my company's annual revenue was last year? $32 million. Do you know what our projected revenue is for next year? $78 million. That's not security. That's transformational wealth. That's the kind of success that changes families for generations." The numbers seemed to hit my father like physical blows. He had spent his entire career managing other people's money, helping wealthy clients optimize their portfolios and plan for their financial futures. The idea that his own daughter had built something worth more than most of his clients' combined assets was clearly challenging every assumption he had made about success, risk, and the nature of wealth creation. William Sterling looked up from his phone with an expression that could only be described as hunger. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice taking on the carefully modulated tone that wealthy men used when they sensed opportunity. "I hope you'll forgive my earlier comments about technology investments. I was speaking generally, of course, not about companies with your level of proven success and market validation." The speed of his transformation from skeptic to supplicant was almost breathtaking. 20 minutes earlier, he had been lecturing the table about the foolishness of tech investments and the superiority of traditional assets. Now faced with concrete evidence of my company's value, he was backtracking so quickly it was almost comical. "Of course," I replied mildly. "Though I have to say, your general comments about tech startups burning through venture capital were particularly interesting, given that our investors include some of the most successful venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. They seem quite confident in our ability to generate returns." Gregory Ashford had been remarkably quiet during this exchange, but now he looked up from his phone with the expression of dawning comprehension. "Miss Blackwood," he said slowly, "I've been reading about your company's legal structure and intellectual property portfolio. The patent applications alone represent millions of dollars in potential licensing revenue. How did you navigate the regulatory approvals for medical AI without established legal counsel? It was a good question, and one that revealed his professional interest in understanding how I had built something so complex without the traditional support systems that most entrepreneurs relied on. Actually, I replied, we worked with Morrison, Fletcher and Associates for our FDA submissions and patent filings. They're one of the premier healthcare law firms in the country. The recognition hit Gregory immediately. Morrison, Fletcher and Associates was one of the most prestigious law firms in Denver, the kind of white shoe practice that charged premium rates and only accepted clients with serious resources and legitimate prospects for success. The fact that they had taken on Neuralink Solutions as a client was itself a form of validation that spoke volumes about our company's credibility and potential. I know Morrison Fletcher, Gregory said quietly. If they're representing you, that means their due diligence team vetted your technology, your business model, and your market opportunity. They don't take on clients they don't believe in absolutely. The implication was clear. If one of Denver's most respected law firms was willing to stake their reputation on Neuralink Solutions, then my company was far from the speculative fantasy my family had imagined it to be. We were a legitimate enterprise with real technology, real revenue, and real prospects for continued growth. Caroline had returned to scrolling through articles about my company, her fascination growing with each new detail she discovered. There's a piece in TechCrunch about your plans for international expansion, she said, looking up at me with something approaching respect. It mentions partnerships with hospitals in Japan, Germany, and Australia. How did you develop relationships with medical institutions on 3 continents? The question revealed her genuine curiosity about how someone she had dismissed as a struggling entrepreneur had managed to build a global enterprise. Medical researchers are a tight-knit community, I explained. When your technology delivers results that save lives, word spreads quickly. Our first international partnership came through a referral from a radiologist at Denver Health who had used our platform to identify a rare form of pediatric cancer. He presented our case study at a conference in Tokyo, and within 6 months we had 3 Japanese hospitals requesting pilot programs. The story seemed to resonate with something in my father's expression, perhaps the recognition that I had built my success through the same kind of relationship building and reputation management that had defined his own career. The difference was that instead of managing other people's money, I had created technology that was actually changing lives. Marcus had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now he leaned forward with obvious interest. Zara, when you say your technology saves lives, what exactly do you mean? I understand the business side, but what does your AI actually do that's different from traditional diagnosis? It was the first question anyone in my family had asked that demonstrated genuine interest in understanding my work rather than simply quantifying its financial value. Our AI analyzes medical imaging data, CT scans, MRIs, X-rays, and identifies patterns that human radiologists might miss. I explained, for example, we can detect certain types of lung cancer 6 months earlier than traditional methods, which dramatically improves patient outcomes. We've also developed algorithms that can identify rare genetic disorders in pediatric patients, cases where children might have suffered for years with misdiagnosed conditions. The room had gone completely silent as I spoke, the reality of what I was describing sinking in around the table. This wasn't just about money or business success, it was about technology that was literally saving human lives, preventing suffering, and giving families hope where none had existed before. How many patients have been helped by your technology? Patricia asked quietly, her voice carrying a note of awe that I had never heard directed toward me before. Our latest internal count is over 14,000 patients whose diagnoses were improved or accelerated by our AI platform, I replied. That includes nearly 3,000 cases of rare diseases that might have gone undiagnosed for months or years without our technology. The magnitude of those numbers seemed to overwhelm my mother completely. She sat back in her chair, staring at me as if seeing her daughter for the first time. This was the woman who had spent years encouraging me to find a more suitable career, to focus on marriage and family instead of pursuing unrealistic professional ambitions. Now she was learning that her daughter's supposedly frivolous computer hobby was responsible for helping save thousands of lives. Richard Thornfield had been uncharacteristically quiet during this medical discussion, but now he looked up with obvious admiration. Miss Blackwood, he said, I have to admit that I've never encountered an entrepreneur who combined such significant financial success with such meaningful social impact. Most of the tech companies I'm familiar with are focused primarily on consumer applications or advertising revenue. What you've built is something entirely different. The acknowledgement from someone of his stature and business experience felt unexpectedly validating. Richard Thornfield had spent decades evaluating investment opportunities and building wealth through careful analysis of market trends and business fundamentals. His recognition that Neuralink Solutions represented something unique in the technology landscape carried weight that extended far beyond his personal opinion. "Thank you," I replied. "Though I have to point out that the financial success follows from the social impact, not the other way around. We're profitable because our technology solves real problems for real people. The revenue comes from hospitals and healthcare systems that see measurable improvements in patient outcomes when they implement our platform." William Sterling looked up from his phone with obvious excitement. "Miss Blackwood, I've been reading about your upcoming IPO plans. The preliminary estimates suggest a valuation that would make Neuralink Solutions one of the most successful Denver-based companies to go public in the last decade." The mention of our initial public offering plans sparked immediate interest around the table. Going public would represent the ultimate validation of everything I had built, the moment when Neuralink Solutions would transition from a private company known primarily within healthcare circles to a publicly traded entity that anyone could invest in. "We're still in the early planning stages," I said carefully. "But yes, we're exploring the possibility of an IPO within the next 18 to 24 months. Our investment bankers believe there's significant market appetite for a healthcare AI company with our track record and growth trajectory." The conversation had completely transformed from the dismissive family dinner that had characterized the evening's beginning. My father's retirement celebration had become a secondary concern as his wealthy friends discovered that the daughter he had been dismissing all evening represented one of the most significant investment opportunities they had ever encountered. But even as I watched their attitudes shift from condescension to respect to barely concealed avarice, I felt a growing sense of disappointment rather than vindication. These were the same people who had spent hours explaining why my career choices were misguided, why technology investments were too risky, why young people like me didn't understand the realities of building lasting wealth. Now faced with undeniable evidence of my success, they were rapidly recalibrating their opinions to align with the new information. The problem was that their newfound respect felt hollow, based entirely on external validation rather than any genuine recognition of my capabilities or vision. They respected me now because Forbes magazine had told them to, because my company's valuation was large enough to command their attention, because other wealthy and influential people had already validated my work. My father had remained silent throughout much of this exchange, his face cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and what might have been remorse. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke directly to me for the first time since Caroline had read the Forbes article aloud. "Zara," he said quietly, his voice lacking the confident authority that had characterized his earlier pronouncements, "I think I owe you an apology." "We all do. I clearly misunderstood what you were building, what you were capable of achieving. I was wrong about you, about your business, about everything." The words I had waited 6 years to hear finally hung in the air between us, but they felt strangely empty now that they had arrived. This wasn't the moment of family reconciliation I had imagined during all those late nights when I was building my company. Instead, it felt like a business transaction, a grudging acknowledgement of success, rather than a genuine recognition of the person I had always been. "Dad," I said slowly, "the problem isn't that you were wrong about my business. The problem is that you never believed in me enough to find out what I was actually doing. You made assumptions about my capabilities, my ambitions, and my potential, and then you spent 6 years defending those assumptions instead of questioning them." The accuracy of my observations seemed to hit him like a physical blow. Around the table, I could see his friends processing the family dynamics they had inadvertently stumbled into, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more complex than a simple misunderstanding about career choices. The evening that had begun as Vincent Blackwood's triumphant entry into Denver's financial elite was transforming into something entirely different, a reckoning with the reality that his daughter had already achieved more than he ever had, and she had done it without his support, his connections, or his approval. The atmosphere in the Continental Club's private dining room had shifted so dramatically that it felt like we were sitting in an entirely different restaurant. What had begun as my father's carefully orchestrated retirement celebration had devolved into something resembling a business networking event, with 3 of Denver's most influential men suddenly treating me like the most important person at the table.
Richard Thornfield had abandoned his dinner entirely, instead pulling out a leather portfolio and making notes with the focused intensity of someone who had identified a major opportunity. "Miss Blackwood," he said, looking up from his writing, "I have to ask about your real estate portfolio. A company of your size and growth trajectory must have significant facilities requirements. Are you currently leasing or do you own your primary operations center?" The question revealed just how completely his perspective had changed in the span of months. Earlier in the evening, he had been dismissing technology companies as unstable investments that created no real value. Now he was probing for ways to potentially profit from my company's expansion, his real estate developer instincts, activated by the scent of a major tenant with deep pockets. "We own our primary facility," I replied calmly. "A 40,000 square foot building in the Denver Tech Center that we purchased 2 years ago when our lease was up for renewal. We also have satellite offices in Boston, Austin, and we're opening a European headquarters in London next quarter." The mention of international expansion sparked immediate interest from Gregory Ashford, who looked up from his phone with obvious excitement. "International operations require significant legal infrastructure," he said, his voice taking on the eager tone of someone who sensed opportunity. "Regulatory compliance, intellectual property protection, employment law across multiple jurisdictions. I don't suppose you've established relationships with law firms in those markets." I could see where this was heading, and the transparent nature of their sudden interest was almost amusing. These were the same men who had spent hours explaining to my father why his daughter's career choices were misguided. Now they were practically salivating at the prospect of capturing some portion of Neuralink Solutions' legal and real estate spending. "We work with Morrison Fletcher here in Denver, as I mentioned," I said. "For international matters, we've established relationships with Magic Circle firms in London and top-tier practices in Boston. Our legal expenses run about $2.3 million annually, but that's expected to increase significantly as we expand into new markets." The number hit Gregory like a lightning bolt. $2.3 million in annual legal fees represented more revenue than most law firms in Denver generated from their 5 largest clients combined. For a solo practitioner or small firm, landing even a fraction of Neuralink Solutions' legal work would be transformational. William Sterling had been furiously typing on his phone, apparently researching something related to our conversation. Now he looked up with the expression of someone who had discovered a treasure map. "Miss Blackwood," he said, "I've been reading about the pharmaceutical partnerships mentioned in the Forbes article. The piece suggests that major drug companies are licensing your diagnostic technology for their clinical trials. Is that accurate?" "Among other applications," I confirmed. "Our AI can identify patient populations for clinical trials more efficiently than traditional methods, which reduces both the time and cost of bringing new drugs to market. We currently have licensing agreements with 3 major pharmaceutical companies, with 2 more expected to close before the end of the year." The implications of what I was describing seemed to overwhelm William completely. Pharmaceutical companies operated with budgets measured in billions of dollars, and anything that could reduce the cost and complexity of clinical trials represented enormous value. If Neuralink Solutions had become an essential part of that process, our revenue potential was virtually limitless. My father had been listening to this exchange with the expression of someone watching his entire understanding of reality crumble in real time. The daughter he had dismissed as someone who played with computers was casually discussing business partnerships with Fortune 500 companies, international expansion, and revenue streams that dwarfed anything he had achieved in 4 decades of financial planning. "Zara," he said, quietly, his voice carrying a note of desperation, "when did you become so sophisticated about business? I mean, the way you're talking about licensing agreements and international expansion. Where did you learn all of this?" The question revealed the depth of his misconceptions about what I had been doing for the past 6 years. In his mind, I was still the young woman who had left the family accounting firm to pursue some vague interest in computers. The idea that I had spent years educating myself about business strategy, regulatory compliance, and international markets had never occurred to him. "Dad," I said gently, "building a company from startup to IPO requires learning about every aspect of business operations. I didn't just develop the technology, I had to understand healthcare regulations, intellectual property law, venture capital, international business development, and corporate governance. You can't scale a company to our size without becoming sophisticated about all of these areas." Patricia had been unusually quiet during this business discussion, but now she spoke up with obvious confusion. Zara, I still don't understand why you never told us about any of this. I mean, if you were building something so significant, why keep it secret from your family? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I could feel the entire table waiting for my response. It was the moment I had been both dreading and anticipating, the opportunity to finally articulate 6 years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. Mom, I said slowly, it wasn't a secret. I tried to share it with you multiple times. But every time I mentioned my work, Dad would change the subject, or make comments about my need to find a more realistic career path. After a while, I realized that you weren't actually interested in what I was building. You were interested in me building something different. The accuracy of my observation seemed to hit both my parents simultaneously.
I watched my father's face as he processed the memory of countless conversations where I had tried to explain my vision, only to have him redirect the discussion toward more conventional career options. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly recognizing his own role in the family dynamic I was describing. Zara, he said quietly, I remember some of those conversations. I thought you were being overly sensitive when you said Mom and Dad weren't taking your work seriously. I didn't realize they were actually discouraging you from pursuing it. It wasn't just discouragement, I replied. It was active dismissal. When I first approached Dad about my business idea 6 years ago, he told me I was being unrealistic and that I should focus on finding a husband instead. When I tried to explain the market opportunity, he said I didn't understand how real businesses worked. When I mentioned the technology, he called it a solution in search of a problem. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Richard Thornfield cleared his throat and stared at his wine glass, clearly wishing he hadn't witnessed this family confrontation. Gregory Ashford studied his hands with intense focus, while William Sterling pretended to be absorbed in his phone. Vincent Blackwood looked like a man who had just realized he had made the most expensive mistake of his life. Not financially, though that was certainly true, but emotionally. He had spent 6 years dismissing his daughter's achievements, only to discover that she had built something extraordinary without his support or guidance. Zara, he said quietly, I think I understand now why you stopped trying to include us in your business. But I want you to know that I never intended to discourage you. I was trying to protect you from what I thought would be inevitable disappointment. Protection, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. You were protecting me from disappointment by ensuring I would never attempt anything ambitious enough to disappoint me. That's not protection, Dad, that's limitation. The distinction seemed to cut through him like a blade. Around the table I could see his friends processing the family dynamics they had stumbled into, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more complex than a simple misunderstanding about career choices. Caroline had been scrolling through her phone throughout much of this exchange, but now she looked up with obvious amazement. Zara, she said, there's a video interview with you on CNBC from last month. You're discussing the future of artificial intelligence in healthcare with some of the most prominent researchers in the field. How did you become recognized as an expert in AI when you're only 29? The question revealed her genuine confusion about how someone she had dismissed as a struggling entrepreneur had managed to become a thought leader in one of the most competitive and rapidly evolving fields in technology. Expertise comes from results, I explained. When your technology consistently outperforms existing solutions, when your research gets published in peer-reviewed journals, when your algorithms save lives that wouldn't have been saved otherwise, the medical community pays attention. Age becomes irrelevant when you're delivering outcomes that matter. William Sterling looked up from his phone with obvious excitement. Miss Blackwood, I've been researching your patent portfolio. According to the USPTO database, Neuralink Solutions holds or has pending applications for over 200 patents related to medical AI. The licensing potential alone could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The mention of our intellectual property portfolio sparked immediate interest from Gregory Ashford, whose law practice included significant intellectual property work. 200 patents, he repeated, clearly trying to calculate the potential value. The development costs alone for that level of IP protection must be enormous. About $12 million to date, I replied. But it's essential protection for a technology company operating in healthcare. Our patents cover everything from our core diagnostic algorithms to our data security protocols to our user interface innovations. The number seemed to stagger Gregory completely. $12 million in patent development represented more money than most law firms would see in their entire existence. The fact that I was discussing it as a routine business expense revealed the scale of operations that Neuralink Solutions had achieved. Richard Thornfield had been making notes throughout this conversation, clearly trying to understand the full scope of my company's operations. Miss Blackwood, he said, you mentioned owning your primary facility and expanding internationally. What are your total fixed assets? I'm trying to understand the scale of your real estate footprint. Current book value of our real estate holdings is about $48 million, I replied. That includes our Denver headquarters, the Boston office, our Austin Development Center, and the London facility we're preparing to open. We also own a data center in Phoenix and lease space in several other markets. The magnitude of those numbers seemed to overwhelm Richard completely. $48 million in real estate assets represented more property value than most development companies accumulated over decades of operations. The fact that a 29-year-old woman had assembled this portfolio while building a technology company challenged everything he thought he understood about wealth creation and business development. My father had been listening to this recitation of my company's assets with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible mathematical equation. Zara, he said slowly, when you say your company owns $48 million in real estate, are you talking about the company's assets or your personal net worth? The question revealed his continued confusion about the relationship between my role as CEO and my personal financial position. Both, I replied. I'm the majority shareholder in Neuralink Solutions, so the company's assets represent my primary source of net worth. My personal liquid assets are separate, of course, but the bulk of my wealth is tied to the company's valuation. Patricia looked up with obvious confusion. Zara, I still don't understand the numbers everyone is discussing. When people say your company is worth $200 million, what does that actually mean for you personally? It was a fair question and one that revealed her genuine lack of understanding about how equity ownership worked in private companies. It means that if we went public tomorrow at current valuation estimates, my shares would be worth approximately $140 million. I explained. Though of course I couldn't sell all of those shares immediately without affecting the stock price. The silence that followed was so profound that I could hear the ambient noise from the Continental Club's main dining room filtering through the closed doors of our private room. $140 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, challenging everything my family thought they understood about wealth, success, and the nature of achievement. Marcus was the first to break the silence. Zara, he said quietly, you're telling us that you're potentially worth more than $100 million. Potentially, yes, I confirmed. Though paper wealth and liquid assets are very different things. The real value comes from the impact our technology has on patients and healthcare systems, not from the financial metrics. William Sterling looked up from his phone with the expression of someone who had just solved a complex puzzle. Miss Blackwood, he said, I've been reading about your management team. According to the Forbes article, you've recruited executives from Google, IBM, and several major pharmaceutical companies. How did you convince senior leaders to leave established corporations to join a startup? The question revealed his genuine curiosity about how I had assembled the kind of world-class leadership team that most entrepreneurs could only dream of attracting. When you're building technology that saves lives, I replied, it's not difficult to attract people who want to be part of something meaningful. Our chief technology officer left Google specifically because he wanted to work on AI applications that had direct social impact. Our VP of Regulatory Affairs came from Pfizer because she believed our platform could accelerate drug development in ways that would benefit millions of patients. The conversation had evolved far beyond the family dinner that had characterized the evening's beginning. My father's retirement celebration had become a detailed business analysis session, with 3 of Denver's most successful men trying to understand how someone they had completely underestimated had built something so significant. But even as I answered their questions and provided the financial details they were hungry for, I felt a growing sense of sadness rather than vindication. These people were responding to my success only because external authorities had validated it, only because the numbers were large enough to command their respect, only because my achievements had been featured in publications they recognized and trusted. The tragedy wasn't that they had underestimated me, it was that they had never been curious enough about my work to discover what I was actually building. For 6 years I had been developing technology that was revolutionizing healthcare, partnering with world-class institutions, and building a company that was changing lives on 3 continents. All of this had been happening in their own city, in their own family, and they had never bothered to look closely enough to see it. Richard Thornfield closed his portfolio and looked directly at me with obvious respect. "Miss Blackwood," he said, "I have to admit that this has been one of the most enlightening conversations I've had in years. I clearly need to reconsider my assumptions about technology investments and the entrepreneurs who are building these companies." "Thank you," I replied. "Though I would suggest that the lesson isn't about technology specifically, it's about the importance of understanding what people are actually doing before you judge the value of their work." The observation hit the table like a thunderclap, the implication clear to everyone present. This wasn't just about business or investment opportunities, it was about the fundamental human tendency to dismiss what we don't understand, to judge based on surface appearances rather than deeper investigation. My father sat in stunned silence, finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what he had missed. For 6 years he had been living in the same city as one of the most successful entrepreneurs in Denver's history, and that entrepreneur was his own daughter. He had dismissed her work, discouraged her ambitions, and failed to recognize her achievements, all while she was building something extraordinary. The retirement celebration that was supposed to mark his entry into Denver's financial elite had instead revealed that his daughter had already achieved more than he ever would, and she had done it without his support, his connections, or his approval. The weight of revelation had settled over our table like morning fog, transforming the elegant dining room into something that felt more like a courtroom where judgment was being passed. My father sat motionless, his hands folded on the white linen tablecloth, staring at me with the expression of someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about his life was fundamentally wrong. The silence stretched between us until William Sterling's phone buzzed with what must have been an urgent notification, because he immediately began reading with intense focus. After a moment he looked up with excitement that bordered on disbelief. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice tight with controlled enthusiasm, "I just received an alert from my investment research service. Apparently Reuters is reporting that Neuralink Solutions has been approached by 3 separate Fortune 500 companies about potential acquisition offers. The preliminary estimates suggest valuations that would make this one of the largest healthcare technology acquisitions in history." The words hit the table like explosives, shattering what remained of the evening's original atmosphere. Gregory Ashford immediately began searching for the Reuters article on his own phone, while Richard Thornfield leaned forward, with the predatory interest of someone who had just scented unprecedented opportunity. "Acquisition offers," my father repeated slowly, as if testing the words in his mouth. "Zara, are you seriously considering selling your company?" I took a sip of my wine, allowing the question to hang in the air while I considered how much to reveal about Neuralink Solutions' strategic planning. The truth was that we had been approached by multiple potential acquirers over the past 6 months, but our board of directors had unanimously decided that the company's long-term value far exceeded any current offers. "We receive acquisition inquiries regularly," I said carefully. "But our technology platform is still in the early stages of its market potential. Selling now would be like harvesting fruit before it's fully ripe. The real value of what we're building won't be apparent for another 3 to 5 years." Richard Thornfield had found the Reuters article and was reading intently, his real estate developer instincts clearly activated by the mention of billion-dollar valuations. "The article mentions that one of the interested parties is a major pharmaceutical company that sees your AI platform as essential to their future drug development strategy," he said, looking up with obvious amazement. "They're apparently willing to pay a premium that values Neuralink Solutions at over $600 million. The number seemed to reverberate around the table like a physical force. $600 million. Even for wealthy men like my father's friends, accustomed to dealing with significant financial transactions, the magnitude of that valuation was staggering. $600 million, my mother whispered, her voice barely audible. "Zara, that would make you one of the wealthiest self-made women in Colorado," I finished for her. Though again, paper wealth and liquid assets are different things. The real value isn't in the money, it's in the potential to scale our technology globally and help millions of patients who currently lack access to advanced diagnostic tools." Patricia stared at me as if seeing her daughter for the first time, struggling to reconcile the woman sitting across from her with the unsuccessful computer hobbyist she had imagined me to be for the past 6 years. The cognitive dissonance was written across her face in expressions of confusion, amazement, and what might have been regret. Marcus had been unusually quiet during this latest revelation, but now he spoke up with obvious emotional strain. "Zara," he said, "I keep thinking about all the family gatherings where Mom and Dad would ask about your work, and you'd just say it was going fine.
You never mentioned investors or partnerships or any of this. We thought you were struggling to make ends meet. Because that's what you wanted to think, I replied, not unkindly but with complete honesty. When someone's reality doesn't match your expectations, you have two choices. You can adjust your expectations, or you can dismiss their reality. For 6 years, this family chose dismissal. The truth of that observation seemed to hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had always positioned himself as the more supportive sibling, the one who occasionally defended me against our parents' harsher judgments. But now he was confronting the reality that his support had been conditional, based on his own assumptions about what I was capable of achieving. Caroline looked up from her phone with an expression of dawning comprehension. "Zara," she said slowly, "I've been reading about your company's hiring practices. According to this TechCrunch article, Neuralink Solutions has one of the most competitive compensation packages in the technology sector. Your average employee's salary is higher than what most lawyers earn." The observation revealed her genuine surprise at discovering that I had built the kind of company that other professionals aspired to work for. In her world of corporate law and traditional career advancement, the idea that someone could create an organization that attracted top talent from established companies was clearly challenging her assumptions about success and leadership. "We compete for the best minds in AI, healthcare, and business development," I explained. "That requires offering compensation packages that reflect the value these people bring to our mission." Our chief science officer turned down a position at MIT to join us because we offered him the opportunity to lead groundbreaking research plus equity that could be worth tens of millions of dollars if we go public. Gregory Ashford had been reading through multiple articles about Neuralink Solutions, his legal mind clearly trying to understand the full scope of what I had built. "Miss Blackwood," he said, "the complexity of your business operations is remarkable. International partnerships, pharmaceutical licensing, medical device regulations, intellectual property protection. You're operating in some of the most challenging legal and regulatory environments in the global economy. Which is why we work with the best legal counsel available," I replied. "Morrison Fletcher handles our domestic operations, but we also have relationships with top-tier firms in London, Frankfurt, Tokyo, and Sydney. Legal compliance isn't an afterthought in healthcare technology, it's foundational to everything we do." William Sterling looked up from his phone with obvious excitement. "Miss Blackwood, I've been researching the venture capital firms that have invested in your company. Kleiner Perkins, Andreessen Horowitz, General Catalyst. These are the most prestigious investors in Silicon Valley. How did you convince them to fund a healthcare AI company based in Denver?" The question revealed his genuine curiosity about how I had attracted world-class investors to a company operating outside the traditional technology hubs of California and Massachusetts. "Results," I said simply. "When your technology consistently outperforms competing solutions, when your revenue growth exceeds projections quarter after quarter, when your partnerships include the most prestigious medical institutions in the world, geographic location becomes irrelevant." My father had been listening to this exchange with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. The daughter he had dismissed as someone who played with computers was casually discussing relationships with venture capital firms that most entrepreneurs could only dream of attracting. "Zara," he said quietly, "I'm trying to understand how you learned to navigate all of this. The business development, the legal complexities, the investor relations. Where did you acquire these skills?" The question revealed his continued inability to grasp that I had spent 6 years educating myself about every aspect of building and scaling a technology company. In his mind, I was still the young woman who had left the family accounting firm without any clear plan for her future. "Dad," I said gently, "when you're building something from scratch, you learn by necessity. I didn't just develop the technology, I had to understand every aspect of the business."
I read everything I could find about healthcare regulations, studied successful AI companies, attended conferences, built relationships with mentors in the industry. You can't scale a company to our size without becoming an expert in multiple disciplines. The explanation seemed to overwhelm him completely. Vincent Blackwood had spent his entire career as a specialist, focusing narrowly on financial planning and investment management. The idea that his daughter had taught herself to become proficient in technology development, business strategy, regulatory compliance, and corporate governance was clearly challenging his understanding of how expertise was acquired and demonstrated. Richard Thornfield closed his phone and looked directly at me with obvious respect. "Miss Blackwood," he said, "I have a confession to make. When I arrived tonight, I was prepared to discuss investment opportunities with your father as he transitions into retirement. I never imagined I would meet someone who had already achieved more business success than most people accomplish in their entire careers. Thank you, I replied, though I would point out that success isn't just about financial metrics. Our technology has helped diagnose rare diseases in children who might have suffered for years without proper treatment. We've identified early-stage cancers that traditional methods would have missed. The real measure of our success is in the lives we've been able to impact. The reminder of the human dimension of my work seemed to shift the conversation's tone from pure business analysis to something more profound. These men had spent the evening discussing valuations and market opportunities, but the underlying reality was that Neuralink solutions existed to solve problems that affected human suffering in the most direct possible way. Gregory Ashford set down his phone and looked at me with an expression that combined admiration and regret. Miss Blackwood, he said, I owe you an apology. Earlier this evening, I made some rather dismissive comments about technology companies and the entrepreneurs who founded them. I clearly spoke from ignorance rather than understanding. Apology accepted, I replied, though I would suggest that the lesson here isn't about technology specifically, it's about the importance of understanding what people are actually doing before judging the value of their work. The observation hung in the air like a challenge to everyone at the table. This wasn't just about business or investment opportunities, it was about the fundamental human tendency to dismiss what we don't understand, to judge based on surface appearances rather than deeper investigation. William Sterling had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up with obvious emotion. Miss Blackwood, he said, I keep thinking about the conversation we had earlier when I was explaining why technology investments were too risky for serious investors. The irony is that your company represents exactly the kind of opportunity I spend my time looking for: proven technology, strong management, growing revenue, expanding markets. I completely missed it because of my own prejudices. The opportunity is still there, I pointed out. When we go public, anyone will be able to invest in Neuralink solutions, though I suspect the valuation will be significantly higher than it would be today. The mention of our eventual IPO sparked immediate interest around the table. Going public would represent the ultimate validation of everything I had built, the moment when Neuralink Solutions would transition from a private company known primarily within healthcare circles to a publicly traded entity that anyone could invest in. Marcus leaned forward with obvious curiosity. Zara, he said, when you talk about going public, what kind of timeline are you considering? And what would that mean for your role in the company? We're targeting an IPO within the next 18 to 24 months, I replied. As for my role, I'll remain as CEO and maintain majority control of the company. The public offering is about raising capital for expansion, not about me stepping away from the business. Patricia had been listening to this discussion with growing amazement. Zara, she said, I still can't believe that all of this has been happening while we thought you were struggling to build a small business. How did we miss so much of what you were accomplishing? The question was both heartbreaking and illuminating, revealing the depth of the disconnect that had developed between my actual life and my family's perception of it. Mom, I said carefully, you missed it because you weren't looking for it. When someone's reality doesn't match your expectations, it's easier to dismiss their reality than to question your expectations. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Around the table, I could see my father's friends processing the family dynamics they had inadvertently stumbled into, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more complex than a simple misunderstanding about career choices. Vincent Blackwood finally spoke, his voice carrying a weight of regret that seemed to age him before our eyes. Zara, he said, I think I'm beginning to understand what I've done. For 6 years, I've been waiting for you to prove that you could build something meaningful, but I never bothered to look at what you were actually building. I was so convinced that I understood the limitations of your potential that I never investigated whether those limitations actually existed. That's exactly right, I confirmed. You created a narrative about who I was and what I was capable of achieving, and then you defended that narrative instead of questioning it. Even when evidence suggested your narrative might be wrong, you found ways to explain that evidence away. The accuracy of my observation seemed to cut through him like a blade. Around the table, his friends shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing their own roles in the evening's revelations. They had all participated in the dismissal of my work, accepting my father's characterization without any independent investigation. Richard Thornfield cleared his throat and spoke directly to my father. Vincent, he said, I think we all owe your daughter more than an apology. We participated in judgments about her work without any real understanding of what she was building. That reflects poorly on all of us. It does, my father agreed. But it reflects most poorly on me. A stranger's ignorance is understandable, but a father's ignorance is inexcusable. I should have been the first person to recognize my daughter's achievements, not the last. The admission seemed to drain something out of him, leaving behind a man who was confronting the most expensive mistake of his life. Not financially, though that was certainly true, but emotionally. He had spent 6 years missing the most important story in his own family, dismissing achievements that most parents would celebrate for generations. Caroline had returned to reading articles about Neuralink solutions, her fascination growing with each new detail she discovered. Sarah, she said, there's a piece in the Harvard Business Review about your leadership philosophy and company culture. They're calling you one of the most innovative CEOs in healthcare technology. The recognition from Harvard Business Review represented a level of academic and professional validation that transcended simple business success. It meant that my approach to leadership and organizational development was being studied and emulated by other entrepreneurs and business leaders. The Harvard piece was particularly meaningful. I admitted. They spent 6 months studying our company culture, interviewing employees at every level, analyzing our decision-making processes and management structure. Their conclusion was that we had created something genuinely unique in the technology sector. William Sterling looked up with obvious amazement. Miss Blackwood, he said, you're 29 years old and business schools are studying your leadership methods. How did you develop your management philosophy? Trial and error mostly, I replied with a slight smile. Though I also spent a lot of time studying companies I admired and trying to understand what made them successful. I read everything I could find about organizational psychology, leadership development, and corporate culture. When you're building something from scratch, you have the opportunity to be intentional about every aspect of how your organization operates. Gregory Ashford had been reading through the Harvard Business Review article on his phone, clearly impressed by what he was discovering. The article mentions that Neuralink Solutions has one of the lowest employee turnover rates in the technology sector, he said. In an industry known for job hopping and competitive poaching, you've managed to create remarkable loyalty among your workforce. People want to be part of something meaningful, I explained. When your work has direct impact on human health and suffering, when you're surrounded by brilliant colleagues who share your mission, when you're compensated fairly and treated with respect, why would you want to leave? We've created an environment where people can do the best work of their careers while knowing that their efforts are literally saving lives. The conversation had evolved far beyond anything that had characterized the evening's beginning. My father's retirement celebration had become a comprehensive analysis of everything I had accomplished, with 3 of Denver's most successful men trying to understand how someone they had completely underestimated had built something so extraordinary. But even as I answered their questions and provided the details they were hungry for, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The vindication I had imagined for 6 years was finally happening, but it felt hollow because it was based entirely on external validation, rather than genuine recognition of my capabilities and vision. Marcus seemed to sense the emotional undercurrents of our conversation. Sarah, he said quietly, I keep thinking about how different this evening could have been if we had known what you were building. If Dad had understood your achievements, tonight would have been a celebration of both your success and his retirement. But that's exactly the point, I replied. You didn't need to wait for Forbes magazine to tell you that my work had value. You could have asked questions, shown interest, tried to understand what I was actually doing. The information was always available, you just weren't curious enough to seek it out. The observation seemed to hit the entire table simultaneously. These were successful, intelligent people who prided themselves on their ability to identify opportunities and evaluate potential. Yet they had all missed the most significant business story happening in their own social circle because they had allowed their preconceptions to override their curiosity. My father pushed his chair back from the table and stood up slowly, as if the weight of realization was physically overwhelming him. Sarah, he said, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Can you ever forgive us for what we've done? Can our relationship recover from 6 years of my failure to see who you really are? The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding honesty rather than politeness. I looked at this man who had raised me, who had provided for my education and upbringing, who had also systematically undermined my confidence and dismissed my achievements. The complexity of those contradictions was almost overwhelming.
Dad, I said carefully, forgiveness isn't the issue here. I forgave you a long time ago because holding on to anger was interfering with my ability to build something meaningful. The real question is whether you can change your fundamental approach to how you see other people's potential. What do you mean? He asked, though I suspected he already knew. I mean that this pattern didn't start with me, and it won't end with me unless you choose to change it. How many other people in your life have you underestimated? How many opportunities have you missed because you were too quick to judge and too slow to investigate? How many relationships have been damaged by your assumption that you understand other people's limitations better than they do? The questions seemed to reverberate through him like physical blows. Around the table, his friends shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that my observations had implications that extended far beyond our family dynamics. Patricia reached across the table and touched my hand gently. "Zara," she said, "you're right about everything, and that makes it even more painful. We failed you as parents, but more than that, we failed ourselves. We missed the opportunity to be part of something extraordinary because we were too proud to admit we might be wrong." "You didn't miss it," I replied. "You're here now, you know what I've built, you understand its significance, and you have the opportunity to be part of what comes next. The question is whether you can move beyond treating me as someone whose worth needs to be proven to treating me as someone whose judgment and capabilities you trust." Richard Thornfield had been listening to this family conversation with obvious discomfort, but now he spoke up with surprising thoughtfulness. "Miss Blackwood," he said, "if I may offer an observation from someone who has made similar mistakes in my own family, the most difficult part of changing how you see someone isn't admitting you were wrong. It's learning to trust your new understanding more than your old assumptions." "That's exactly right," I agreed. "And it's particularly challenging when the old assumptions were comfortable because they confirmed your existing beliefs about how the world works." The insight seemed to resonate with everyone at the table. We had all been confronted with evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about success, achievement, and the nature of potential. The comfortable narratives we had constructed about technology, entrepreneurship, and generational differences had been shattered by the reality of what Neuralink solutions represented. William Sterling stood up and raised his wine glass in what appeared to be an impromptu toast. "To Zara Blackwood," he said, "for building something extraordinary and for teaching us that our assumptions about success are often more limiting than the realities we assume they describe." The others joined the toast, though the atmosphere felt more solemn than celebratory. This wasn't a simple acknowledgement of business success, it was a recognition of how profoundly we had all misunderstood the situation we had been observing for years. As I raised my own glass, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 years of building something meaningful without family support. 6 years of proving myself to everyone except the people whose approval I had originally sought. 6 years of learning that the most important validation comes from the impact your work has on the world, rather than from the recognition of people who should have believed in you from the beginning. "Thank you," I said simply. Though I hope the real lesson here isn't about me specifically, it's about the importance of curiosity over judgment, investigation over assumption, and support over skepticism, when the people you care about are trying to build something meaningful. My father sat back down heavily, his retirement celebration forgotten in the wake of revelations that had fundamentally altered his understanding of his own family. "Zara," he said, "what happens now? How do we move forward from here?" "That depends on you," I replied. "You can treat tonight as an isolated incident, something unusual that happened but doesn't require any fundamental changes in how you approach relationships and assumptions. Or you can treat it as a learning experience that changes how you see potential in other people, how you respond to ideas that challenge your preconceptions, and how you support the people you care about when they're pursuing paths you don't immediately understand." The choice I was offering him was clear, and we both knew it represented far more than just our personal relationship. It was about whether he would learn from this experience and apply those lessons to how he approached other people and opportunities, or whether he would compartmentalize it as a special case that didn't require broader reflection or change. As the evening wound down, and we prepared to leave the Continental Club, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. I had achieved everything I had set out to accomplish when I started Neuralink Solutions 6 years ago. I had built technology that was saving lives, created a company that was changing an entire industry, and established myself as a leader in one of the most competitive and rapidly evolving fields in the global economy. But perhaps more importantly, I had learned that validation from others, while gratifying, was never the real goal. The real goal was building something meaningful, something that made a positive difference in the world, something that justified the risks and sacrifices required to bring it into existence. The Forbes article that had triggered tonight's revelations would be forgotten in a few weeks, replaced by news stories about other entrepreneurs and companies. But the patients whose lives had been saved by our technology, the medical researchers who were using our platform to accelerate their work, the employees who had found meaning and purpose in our mission, those impacts would last for decades. As we walked toward the exit, my father fell into step beside me. "Zara," he said quietly, "I know I can't undo 6 years of mistakes, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Not because Forbes magazine says I should be, but because of who you've become and what you've accomplished." "Thank you, Dad," I replied. "That means more than you know." We stepped out into the crisp Denver evening air, the city lights spreading out before us like stars. Somewhere in those lights were the headquarters of Neuralink Solutions, where tomorrow our team would continue the work of revolutionizing healthcare through artificial intelligence. Somewhere were the hospitals and clinics, where our technology was helping doctors save lives that might otherwise have been lost. And somewhere was my apartment, where this journey had begun 6 years ago, with nothing but an idea, a determination to prove it could work, and the belief that technology could make the world a better place. Tonight had been about vindication, but tomorrow would be about continuing the work that really mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.